Good morning, everyone. This is Diane Murray at Southern Art Gallery. I thought today we would do a quick tip on water management. A lot of my students struggle with how much water it takes to actually put down washes, and that really depends on if you're painting wet on wet or if you're painting wet on dry. Really, water management comes down to how much water is on your paper, how much water is in your brushes, and how much water you have put in your paint mixtures. So if I were to take this brush, which is a Quill, and it holds a tremendous amount of water, and I were to squeeze out the water on this brush, you would see that it holds a huge amount of water. A synthetic brush, on the other hand, like this one, these are both Escodas, by the way. No, excuse me, this is a Da Vinci and this is an Escoda. But this is a synthetic brush. You can tell a synthetic brush by the way it springs. An imitation, this is really an imitation hair brush. It's made with synthetics, but it's meant to mimic hair, so you can see it's not as responsive. It doesn't have that spring back. And even if you had a large synthetic, it wouldn't hold. Okay, if you had a large synthetic, let's use this one. You had a large synthetic like this, which is another Perla, and you squeeze it out, you see how hardly any water comes out at all. So you can see the difference. This is a 14 and this is a 4 in a Quill. But you can see by looking at these two brushes how much the different water, how much the amount of water varies between brushes. I think students forget this and they just pick up any old brush and try to control their water that way. If I were to take this fully loaded brush, and I'm just going to use some colors on my palette, and I were to just make a wash, this is how much water and pigment this brush holds. And you can see I can cover virtually the whole little 6x9 piece of watercolor paper with one brush. Okay, if I were to take the synthetic brush here and do the same thing right on top, you can see that it already starts running out of pigment and liquid about halfway down. So this is really important to remember when you're doing the different watercolor washes and trying to get different effects. So I use these large mop brushes to put down large amounts of wet washes. And I use the synthetics with the spring tip to do more detail. So anytime I'm doing detail, it's usually with a synthetic brush. Okay, that's the first thing, is the water in your brush. And this is something you have to practice. Now the water on your paper is something else again. As you can see on this paper, it's very wet here, but it's starting to dry right down here. And you check whether your paper is wet or not with the back of your hand, so you don't get the oil on your paper. And so you're going to get a very different effect when you put a mark, and we'll just wet this. This isn't a lovely color, but it'll work. Okay, so if I have this much water in this brush and I make a mark on the wet paper, you're going to see how it spreads. It's going to spread much more. It's going to be less controlled, and we're going to have a very much of a harder time controlling it. If I come down here, even though this is still wet, and I go ahead and put the marks on the almost dry paper, you can see the different effect. So how much water is on your paper, how much water is on your brush are critical. So you have to learn to balance the water ratios. Too much, too little, And then the other thing too is how much pigment versus water you have. So if you have a mixture like this, all right, and you add a whole lot of water to it, then of course you're going to get a very wet, light mark. If you take a heavy pigment, all right, let's just take this right out of the, and these wells have been pre-moistened, and as you can see, I just wet them enough to get the pigment flowing. So if I wanted this to really be a strong mark, I would use mostly pigment and a lot less water, and I could get a mark like this. So you can see that that makes a huge difference. So when you're doing these washes and when you're learning watercolor, and even if you're a watercolorist, you've been doing watercolor for quite a while, always pay attention to how much water is in your brush, how much water is on your paper, and the water pigment ratio in your paints. And it's good to do little practices like this, and it will help you learn to manage your water, because of course in watercolor it's all about the water. So there you have it, and I hope you found this helpful, and if you did, please subscribe to our channel, and we will see you soon.